Memory is a funny thing. The process of ingesting, storing, and recalling information is so constant and automatic that we simply take it for granted, yet it is so absolutely central to our identity. You are you because of your memories. And much of the time, that memory is wonderful, a way of preserving our most precious experiences, letting the joy linger on year by year. It can strengthen, bolster, and inspire not only ourselves, but also the people we love. Memory can also be a terrible thing, a burden that weighs heavily, our deepest regrets returning to haunt us in the dreary hours of the night. It can diminish our joy, impair our relationships, and make it difficult to move forward. But all memories, both good and bad, are transient. With time they change, warping and fading until at last they are gone forever, since ultimately your memories only last as long as you do. 1000xResist is a game that asks you to reckon with your own memory and mortality as it addresses a veritable kaleidoscope of themes, including historical events like the anti-extradition Hong Kong protests and the COVID-19 pandemic, religious concepts like original sin, forgiveness, redemption, and estrangement from God, and social topics like the vast Asian diaspora, generational trauma, heredity, nature versus nurture, and the cruelty of time. However, much like the profound titles it was inspired by, Nier Automata, 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim, and Signalis to name a few, 1000xResist is more interested in asking questions than providing answers, leaving many of these ideas open-ended and subject to interpretation. It is also very complex, with the story spanning over 1,000 years, following over a dozen characters, and largely told out of order through second-hand fragments of memory. As such, this video is intended to serve two purposes. It is both a thorough explanation of the story from beginning to end, assembled in roughly chronological order, and a thoughtful exploration of its many themes, all considered in their proper context within the story. With regard to the title of the video, I should clarify that this analysis is only complete in the sense that I will be discussing every major character, event, and concept, hopefully making the story clear for anyone seeking to understand it. But beyond that are plenty of smaller details and connections that I will not be addressing here, for sake of time more than anything else. Some things just don't fit in the backpack, and I had to make the often agonizing decision of what to keep and what to leave behind, prioritizing what I felt was the most important. If you're at all concerned about spoilers, then you definitely shouldn't be watching this video, but at the same time I think there's plenty left to find yourself should you choose to play the game afterwards. One last thing, and then we'll dive in. I want to be very clear that this video is simply my own interpretation of an incredible work of art and is by no means definitive or infallible. You may come to very different conclusions than I have here, and I think that's by design. 1000xResist is a rich, multifaceted experience that every player will engage with differently, and as I see it, why would Sunset Visitor leave space for so many interpretations if not to encourage them?
There is a you, and it has a pattern we are looking at.
For all of its sci-fi trappings, the aliens, time travel, and so forth, 1000xResist is a deeply human story. A story of thousands of sisters over 1,000 years, and their efforts both to embrace and resist the traditions of the world they've inherited. And it all begins here, on a street in Hong Kong during the 2019 protests, with the young man and woman who will become Iris's parents. They meet by happenstance. Father's nose was broken in a police beating, and after Mother helps tend to the wound, he smoothly asks for her number. One thing leads to another, and they fall in love, balancing this relationship with their passionate involvement in the protests. They gave it their all out on the streets, fighting for their rights, watching friends get killed, all the while being hounded by the police themselves. But after the brutal government crackdown and sweeping COVID-19 pandemic brought the protests to an end, they decided enough was enough, choosing to leave everything behind and move to Toronto, Canada. They try settling into their new lives as best they can, Mother working as a nurse and Father running a noodle cart, but both are deeply traumatized by what they experienced in Hong Kong. Mother, whose name we later learn is Clara, suffers insomnia and severe post-traumatic paranoia, plagued by nightmares while she sleepwalks, and Father later admits that he had lost all faith and respect for this world. He did not want to bring a child into such a world as this, but Mother felt differently, believing so deeply that this was how to reclaim the dignity they had lost, and so only a short time later, Iris is born. Unfortunately, as we get to know this family, it becomes clear very quickly that it's not a very happy one. Mother is strict, impossible to please, and verbally abusive to her daughter, as her own mother was to her. Meanwhile, father is something of a pushover, permissive, likely a learned behavior to cope with and counteract his wife's dominating influence over the family. They argue frequently, especially about the past, and to their young daughter there is no worse sound than her mother shrieking. As it so often does in these situations, the trauma of one generation is passed down into the next, and Iris becomes a very troubled child. Out of all the memories we see of her home life, there is only one that is truly happy: the day they move into their new and final apartment. Sunlight is streaming through the windows, her parents are smiling, and Iris tells her beloved pet hamster about all the fun they're going to have. But this sours very quickly, transitioning into a truly horrific scene. In a fit of rage, Iris had introduced that same beloved pet to the microwave. This is more than just acting out. As we will see, Iris is a veritable sociopath, unempathetic, unstable, and prone to bursts of rage and violence. Bobo is only the first victim of those tendencies, and as the trait is passed into her posterity, Iris herself will become the last. So, all of this being established, it should come as no surprise that this family is very difficult to like. They are abrasive, dysfunctional, and sometimes despicable, but never irredeemable. See, at the very heart of 1000xResist lies the eternal conflict between justice and mercy. On the one side is choice, responsibility, and accountability. The idea that you are always responsible for your words and actions and are subject to be judged and either rewarded or punished accordingly. On the other side is compassion, healing, and absolution. The idea that no one is beyond forgiveness, that anyone can change no matter how far they have fallen if we will only give them the chance, or chances, to do so. Yes, Iris and her parents make terrible decisions that have serious consequences on others, but at the same time, they are victims too, caught in a vicious cycle of trauma that existed long before them and will persist long after. Choice matters, but so does context, which means there must be room for both justice and mercy. The question is, where do you draw the line? It's a question with no easy answer, and one that we will see all of their descendants grapple with as the conflict ripples through time. But all that comes later. Right now, Iris has a more immediate problem: struggling to fit in at school. In addition to all the regular difficulties of navigating life and school as a teenager, Iris must deal with the fact that she isn't like the other students. She may not know Hong Kong personally or speak its language, but that is still her heritage, and that makes her different. She is subject to racial prejudice and stereotyping, bullying, and even at the best of times there is tension between her two cultures. At her birthday party, for example, Iris worries what her classmates will think of her family's traditional noodles and asks for pizza instead, much to the chagrin of her father.
All the longevity for me, and no more for you.
Ultimately, Iris comes to resent her parents for leaving Hong Kong, believing that they gave up too easily when they should have stayed and kept fighting, believing that, somehow, her life would be better had they chosen to stay. The one bright spot in Iris's high school experience was art, something she had a notable talent for and that served as something of an outlet for her emotions. But unfortunately, it isn't nearly enough, and she starts to cope in other ways. She tries blocking out the world with headphones, starts taking medication, possibly mood stabilizers, and in time develops an eating disorder which manifests in her becoming vegetarian, sneaking food during the night, smoking cigarettes, and trying to rationalize cheat days like her birthday. When at home, she locks herself in her room to escape, spending more time with her phone than anything or anyone, using it to turn off the anxious, stressful, anguished thoughts. No one is there for her. Iris is alone. Or at least that's how she feels. In truth, someone is there for her. Zhao. Much like Iris, Zhao and her mother recently immigrated from Hong Kong and struggle to adapt to life in this new country. And while they become acquainted on this common ground, the two girls couldn't be more different. In contrast to Iris's moody, standoffish disposition, Zhao is cheerful, kind, and chatty. She is also infatuated with Iris, constantly idolizing her, wanting to be like her, and deeply in love with her. Which makes it all the more a tragedy that Iris is awful to Zhao, always pushing her away, criticizing her at every opportunity. She berates her for speaking Mandarin instead of English, feels embarrassed to be seen with her, and even tells Zhao that no one will like her unless she stops being herself. It is heartbreaking to watch many of these interactions, but all for a purpose, as Zhao plays a very important role in the story. She is the foil to Iris. Their circumstances are similar. Zhao also belongs to an immigrant family and is struggling to adjust to a new culture, dealing with trauma, ever haunted by a place that no longer exists. And in some ways, she has it even worse than Iris. Her father was killed in the protests, leaving her to be raised by her mother alone, and English is her second language, which means school is even more of a challenge. She is hurting too, but chooses not to be defined by that pain or perpetuate it, and is instead endlessly kind.
Well, you can sit with me. There's lots of room.
Of course, there's plenty of nuance here, and I'm not trying to suggest that Iris is all bad while Zhao is all good, but it's undeniable how their choices shaped them into very different people. This is what Iris could have been, or at least tried to have been, and if she had, then things might have turned out very differently indeed.
There is a landing and a remaining.
The primary antagonist of 1000xResist is a race of alien beings known as the Occupants, and over the course of the story we learn a number of interesting details about their form and origin. These mysterious cosmic entities each appear as a network of concentric spinning rings, though I suspect this isn't their true form and is more likely the only way humans can perceive them, for it is implied that they exist in 4 dimensions and are not constrained by physical boundaries like we are. Regardless, they are essentially vessels of memory, consuming and storing memories produced by other intelligent beings to grow and form an identity. Upon reaching maturity, they are able to branch or replicate themselves to reproduce, in the process choosing which of these memories to pass on. And so it was that a number of these entities were branched into the vast emptiness of space with only one precious memory, the vision of 2 stars entangled, one eating the other. And though none of them knew the meaning, it was generally accepted that this system was their home, a home that their progenitors were forced to leave. Now adrift in the cosmos, they wandered, searching to form their own memories, and part of this group was eventually drawn to Earth due to the vivid conjurings they sensed there. The occupants were not hostile though, and shortly after their arrival, many of them tried to communicate by manifesting human-like bodies of their own, giant red approximations that almost looked like the real thing. And for a moment, it seemed as though humanity was responding. The occupants communicate by referencing memory, and so when humans began to produce memories of these giant red bodies, it was seen as a transmission, an encouraging sign of resonance. But of course, this was only a correlation. No true understanding had been reached, and the rift between these very different beings was much larger than either side could imagine. As news of these strange cosmic visitors spread, humanity tried everything they could to communicate with them, every method that could possibly be conceived, but none had any effect whatsoever. Until they tried music. In desperation, they played Bach to the occupants on a grand piano, and in so doing, ushered in the beginning of the end. Unfortunately, all of the harmony and beauty that humans perceived in this melody was completely lost on their alien visitors. They heard nothing but discord, unnatural vibrations of unstable frequencies from an ugly, rigid instrument, and, mistaking this to mean that humans enjoyed such conflict, decided to give them discordance in kind. The occupants had surely noticed that humans produced more vivid memories when shedding tears, so they created a deadly airborne virus that caused people to shed all of the water in their bodies, literally crying themselves to death. But even apart from the symptoms, this was no ordinary virus, as the occupants were in control of who would get sick and when. To humans, it seemed impossibly unpredictable, appearing to mutate with every subject and rendering any potential cure immediately obsolete. Making matters worse, the occupants had now spread around the entire Earth, seeking after strong emotion and memory, meeting it with death. They were especially drawn to high concentrations of the same emotion, like at a high school dance, but we'll get to that in a moment, and had found that there was no signal more clear than the anticipation of one's own demise. The work of death accelerated, and before long the occupants had become drunk on the bottomless ocean of memory, spilling it from their very being. It was far too much for any single one of them to hold, and so they decided to manifest an us, a giant red shell encasing the planet, a sort of cosmic hard drive to contain all of the memories and let nothing go to waste. The environmental impact of this was devastating. Global temperatures rose rapidly, warming the oceans and causing most marine life to perish, and as ice from the poles began to melt, there was massive flooding in coastal regions. The world became a red wasteland, victim of an unconditional apocalypse. But the occupants did not see things this way. As immortal vessels of memory, death meant nothing more to them than a lossy transfer of information, and since all of humanity's memory had been perfectly preserved in the red shell, they believed humans were doing as well as ever. Better even, for their memories would now remain protected even when the sun eventually exploded in a system-shattering supernova. They had done humanity a great favor, or so they thought, and saw themselves as the keepers of this world. While most of these so-called keepers were perfectly content to skim memories from the surface of their hosts, some took a special interest in humans and chose individuals who would remain, transfiguring their bodies to prevent them from ever catching the virus or even aging a single more day. One such occupant chose Iris, and for a simple reason. She was mean. Her cruel, belligerent tendencies elicited strong reactions in those around her, forming vivid memories it found very desirable, and that is precisely what happened the night of the school dance. Earlier that day, Iris had said something about Zhao to the other students, something terrible, and upon learning this at the dance, Zhao ran. Away from Iris, from the school, from this place that had always treated her so poorly. Iris chased after her, perhaps feeling guilty, and both ran headlong into the occupant as it observed their exchange. Iris was chosen to remain, and Zhao was chosen to die. One of the game's biggest mysteries is what exactly Iris said. Though plenty of hints are given, they stop just short of giving us the answer. We know that Zhao drew pictures and wrote letters for Iris, putting them in her locker, and it is implied that Iris shared some of their contents. It could have been something as simple as a declaration of love, but based on the way Iris's teachers and classmates react, it was something more personal and damaging than that.
What you said about Zhao, it was highly inappropriate. We've notified your parents.
Whatever it was, the tears that Zhao began to shed on that lonely street never stopped, and she succumbed to the disease shortly thereafter, along with every single student who had been at the dance that night. Every student except Iris. News of the event and her miraculous immunity spread quickly and eventually attracted the attention of the 50, a classified government project that wanted to study Iris in hopes of uncovering her secret. On a cold, rainy evening, the researchers Johnson and Mimi visit the family's apartment, asking Iris to come with them, and in direct defiance of her incredulous parents, she agrees. Iris locks herself in her room, looking around it one final time and deciding what to put in her backpack, while Mother chastises her through the door and tells her never to come back. She finishes packing her bag, walks out the door, and never sees her parents again. Understandably, they are devastated, and in her absence struggle to survive in an increasingly desolate and hopeless world. Curiously, though, neither of them ever contract the virus. Clara believes she might be immune herself, and while this is never confirmed, it could be that her DNA was close enough to Iris that the virus passed her over.
Maybe we are meant to survive this.
But there was plenty more to worry about than the virus. All of human civilization was falling apart at a scale and pace nearly unimaginable, and the city became a dangerous place where they had to loot and scavenge to survive. Food became scarce, and 62 days after Iris's departure, Clara insists that they make videos for her to watch when she returns, to make sure she knows they suffered, to which Father replies that they don't even know when or if Iris will watch them. And he brings up a great point. How are we seeing this? How did Iris know what happened to her parents if she never returned? The answer is genetic memory. Near the end of the game, we learn that memories are stored in your DNA, etched into your genetic code, and because all of her parents' memories were perfectly preserved by the occupants, Iris was able to see what they had seen by leveraging the power of her familiars. And so she sees when her father has finally had enough. He is so very tired of the struggle to survive with no hope, and after recording one final video for Iris and Clara, jumps off the balcony of their apartment. Mother's fate is left ambiguous, but there is no doubt that one way or another, she passed on as well, leaving the family's legacy in the hands and hair of her daughter.
We take from you, and you take from us.
As the world collapsed into chaos and the occupants' deadly disease ravaged a rapidly decreasing population, one hope remained: the 50. A massive, collaborative effort in which countries across the globe pooled their resources together in a last-ditch effort to save themselves, perhaps the greatest act of unity the world had ever seen. Early attempts involved sending special craft into orbit, but after those turned up poor results, they turned their attention to the ocean, building 50 enormous submersible ships whose purpose was to preserve a small remnant of humanity and work toward finding a cure for the disease. Each was extremely well-stocked and equipped, built to last for hundreds of years, and could carry up to 2,000 passengers. As you might expect, it was very difficult to get one of these spots, and we are told that all who did had to lie, cheat, or steal their way on. All except for Iris, of course, who was reserved a special place on the last ship, the Pacific 50, overseen by Johnson himself. Eventually, the ships were filled and it was time to make their descent. But there was a big problem. Bidding farewell to the sky and sinking into an uncertain future was bound to cause a surge of shared emotion among the passengers of each ship. Anticipation, apprehension, maybe a bit of claustrophobia. And considering how many passengers there were, this would inevitably attract the occupants' fixed attention. To counteract this, they needed a diversion. Knowing ahead of time that the occupants were drawn to suffering like bees to honey, the 50's headquarters in North America, Central 1, planned 5 simultaneous, consistent shellings of the remaining most populated areas, these being Seattle, LA, New York, Toronto, and Houston, with similar actions being taken in other parts of the world. The cities were warned beforehand, but the idea was that the collective fear of their inhabitants running, hiding, and sheltering from the barrage would make good cover for the 50's descent. And so, as one, all 50 ships began to sink into the dark ocean, slipping quietly beneath the waves. But not quietly enough. The occupants noticed almost immediately, flocking to the ocean, and in response 4 of the ships activated self-flooding, using the grueling anticipation of their own deaths to save the others. A terrible sacrifice, but not in vain, for without it none of the ships would have made it at all. Upon reaching the target depth of 1,000 meters, the Pacific 50 only received affirmative transmissions from 7 of the 50 ships, and Central 1 had gone dark as well. The news was grim, but Johnson tells his inner circle, the bridge crew, not to tell anyone else aboard the ship in order to keep their spirits high. They had work to do. And so it was that on the first day of the first year, the firstborn arrived at the garden. Iris basked in her new freedom, finally liberated from her parents, but this jubilation faded very quickly. Under the direction of lead researcher Mimi, Iris was subject to all manner of experiments that quickly became extreme, so much so that they were later redacted from her memory either by herself or by Principal. The focus of these experiments was cloning, and the first 5 years were spent optimizing the process. Namely, growing them quickly and implanting them with language and motor skills so they would come out immediately more useful. Before long, there were other irises walking around the ship, but unlike the original, these ones were happy, smiling more and trusting of everyone. And Iris became jealous. In a fit of rage, she murdered one of these clones with a knife, cutting her throat, callously rationalizing that the researchers would simply make more to replace her. And sadly, that was true, for every clone failed the ultimate test: exposure to the disease. They cried out like everyone else, and so the Pacific 50 accelerated production, creating hundreds if not thousands of them to make up for their mortality rate. We learned that some were dissected, like squid in a high school science lab, and in another branch of research their fertility was tested. Mimi suggested they try getting Iris pregnant as well, but this is where Johnson drew the line, saying they had put her through enough already. Interestingly, it is briefly mentioned that they had a backup, a child, just like a real human thing. Based on context, it would seem this was a clone carried by a surrogate and allowed to age naturally, rather than being artificially birthed in a pod, but whatever the case may be, we never hear of this child again. Years pass by, and as the research continues failing to turn up any results, hope begins to wane. People start to commit suicide in waves, and their numbers are summarily replaced by children who are born on the inside. Eventually, Command starts to prepare for this next generation, training researchers to replace Mimi, each getting their own Iris. But things were still going badly, and not just for the Pacific 50. One day, out of nowhere, Pacific 41 cut all communications, and their final transmission was troubling.
No words, just screaming, and then something worse.
In the midst of all this chaos, Iris begins to miss Zhao, feeling her loss now more than ever. She came to recognize that Zhao was the only real friend she ever had, and things had never been the same without her. This gives her an idea, and so she convinces Johnson to take her up to the surface and return to the old high school. She told him that it was time to try something different, and that she had a theory about socialized immunity, but really it was just an excuse to hold a seance for Zhao. And it actually works. Well, sort of, eventually. On the roof of the school, we meet Picture Zhao, a floating, talking version of the girl who continues to be seen with Iris for the rest of the game, and while there is no doubt that she exists purely in Iris's head, I think more is going on here than an overactive imagination. As we see time and time again, memory is deep and complicated, and I think a useful analogy for understanding it is that of raw camera footage. For those unfamiliar, this is essentially unprocessed data captured directly from a camera sensor that contains far more information than what can be conveyed in a single version of the image. Ultimately, this footage will be converted and compressed into a much smaller format, but you can always return to the raw files and get something slightly different each time. That's pretty much exactly how communions work, as they make it possible to have new conversations with old memories, revisiting places from the past, reliving those events, and eliciting slightly different reactions from the people who were there. Things they might have said had you chosen your words and actions differently. Basically, you can think of Picture Zhao as a reverse communion of sorts, one that pulls the Zhao from Iris's memory into her world rather than the other way around. But that will come later, long after the seance, and at any rate, Johnson is furious with Iris for putting them all in danger for a simple memorial.
I hope you've enjoyed your little excursion. You will not have another one for a very long time.
They return to the ship, and conditions continue to worsen. 30 years and 3 months had passed with no meaningful research progress, and rumors began to spread that Iris and Mimi were in some kind of clandestine relationship. It's unclear what, if anything, was actually happening, but eventually Iris had had enough of the lead researcher and stabbed her through with a knife. She died shortly thereafter, and with her went the last wisp of hope for the Pacific 50. Members of the bridge crew began committing suicide, while others staged a mutiny, revoking Johnson's biometrics and giving themselves administrative access. They believed the research was futile and that they should try linking up with Pacific 41, despite the ship having gone dark years before. But all of this commotion did not go unnoticed. Other members of the crew crowded onto the bridge, demanding to know what was going on, and in an adrenaline-fueled panic, the security guards opened fire and massacred everyone. It was a step too far, quickly attracting the attention of an occupant, the very same that had chosen Iris years before. It had likely been lingering close to the ship, keeping a close watch on her, and could not resist such a feast. Meanwhile, at the other end of the ship, Johnson confronts Iris over Mimi's murder, but is suddenly interrupted by the appearance of the occupant, who had made its way from the bridge to the orchard. They reach out to Iris, communicating with her by repurposing fragments of her past, and offer her a gift: the familiars. Knowing that human memory was fallible, the occupant had branched from itself 3 others to serve as a medium for Iris to keep everything, storing her memories outside of herself. A bridge for her to better understand them, and for them to better understand her. But this needed to be an equal exchange. In return for deep, intimate access to her memories, Iris would be given command of the occupant's power. And she accepts. She was done with Johnson, with her clones, with everyone, and swiftly used this new power to kill every living soul aboard the ship, water pouring from their bodies as though the ocean itself had asked for it back. Until finally, the firstborn was the last one left.
There is a fundamental reordering.
For the first time in over 30 years, the Pacific 50 was silent. Iris enjoyed the silence at first, hiding herself away in a cave to process everything she had been through and everything she had done, but it didn't take long for her to become lonely. She looked around at the beautiful garden that was the orchard and had a vision of what it could be, a great utopia, and so she decided to clone again. But this time, she was going to do it her way. Plucking 5 hairs from her head, she created 5 identical sisters to inhabit the garden and gave them the law. She was the All-Mother and they were her children. They were free to go where they pleased, to partake of the many wonders the place offered, to do anything they wished, save one: making more clones. For the power to create a life belonged only to the All-Mother, and the punishment for crossing this line was death.
No sisters we make, no promise we break. Pluck hair from our heads, so slain us dead.
But law is not the same thing as discipline, and despite the sisters' unanimous obedience to this rule, Iris quickly found parenting to be more difficult than she anticipated. Struggling to tell the sisters apart, she assigned each their own color to wear, and struggling to keep them from quarreling, she assigned each one a function to perform: a fixer to maintain the ship, a healer to serve as their medic, a bang-bang fire for security, a knower to archive their knowledge, and finally a watcher to observe the others in their work. Iris needed to keep them busy for another reason as well. She had a function to perform now too. In exchange for the great work of death wrought by the occupant, whom Iris refers to in plural tense as the Keepers, she had willingly offered herself up, and was now bound to share with them her memories both old and new. Essentially, to commune, except these were much more intense than the ones we experience in the game. They are often referred to in a sensual way as something deeply intimate and invasive, Iris's very mind being violated by an overwhelming alien presence. Such encounters were exhausting and even caused her physical harm, burning her skin and causing clumps of her hair to fall out. For a time, Iris alone was enough to satisfy the Keepers, but eventually their eyes began to wander and they asked her for access to the clones' minds and memories as well. But Iris resisted. These were her children. For the first time in her life, she had something to lose and was willing to fight to protect it.
I am all you need. I have more to give.
But that does not mean the sisters were safe. On one occasion, Iris is late to the planned communion, and as a gentle reminder of her duty, the Keepers lash out and harm 4 of the sisters in a sick, twisted game. Sister Pink was left in especially bad shape, and Iris cries with relief when the girl finally starts to recover. It is here that we finally start to see the good in Iris, the kindness and compassion that was dormant for so long, and we can absolutely sympathize with her awful predicament. She felt trapped. In her body, her age, her time, filled with mounting regret for some of the things she had done, and ever tormented by the Keepers like a hamster in the rough hands of a child. But some good did come of this. One day, Iris has an epiphany, realizing that her children may be able to grow in a way she cannot. She gathers them together for the first communion, repurposing the familiar's function to share her memories with them directly, firmly believing that the most important thing for them to do, whether they like it or not, is to remember. It was a precious moment of unity for the young family, but unfortunately, things go downhill from here. Despite being cloned from the same source, all of the sisters were different, and youngest needed by far the most time and attention from her mother. This was challenging for Iris, but ironically enough led to youngest becoming her favorite, much to the chagrin of the other sisters, who came to resent her special treatment and had become tired and irritated of being watched all the time. But youngest wanted to change that, and so the day before Iris's planned birthday celebration, she asks to play with them, and the sisters patronizingly agree to a game of hide and seek. All that day and into the night, youngest seeks, but is unable to find even a single one. Flushed in the face and dark in the heart, she unexpectedly stumbles upon the cave where Iris had hidden away Zhao's diary lying forgotten on the stone. And in it she finds not only Iris's words of longing for her old friend, but also a single strand of Zhao's hair. And youngest makes a decision. That very night, she partakes of the forbidden fruit, creating an unsanctioned clone, rationalizing that because the hair was not taken from her own head, it fell outside the established law. So badly did she yearn for love, so desperately did she want to prove that she was worth something, that she barely even noticed the clone had been pulled out too soon and wasn't fully formed.
You are the best thing I have ever done.
The next day, youngest arrives at the birthday party and presents her gift to Iris, prepared for her life to change forever. And it does. The All-Mother's retribution is swift. In an instant, she leaps forward, slashing the clone's throat and spraying its blood across the courtyard, furious with youngest for breaking the law of the garden and reawakening such a painful memory. The other sisters quickly step forward to try and protect youngest, to de-escalate the situation, but this only adds fuel to the fire. What the communion shows next is that Iris punishes their open defiance by stripping away their immunity, condemning them to be taken by the virus. Except all of that is a lie. What actually happens is Iris departs for the other side, taking the sisters with her, believing that this was the right thing for both of them. She would finally get some peace and quiet, and youngest would finally have a chance to grow. The poor sister was removed from the presence of her god, much like Eve in the final days of Eden, except instead of being cast out of the garden, she was simply left there alone. As a punishment befitting her crime, the All-Mother commanded her to multiply and replenish, to make sisters dawn to dawn, to make and unmake them until she had created sisters so pure and perfect that her sin could be forgiven. So why is the false account of her sister's demise part of the communion? I think this is what youngest wished had happened, her sisters standing up for her, burning for her rather than leaving her behind, and the reason this memory can exist at all is because youngest had been left with the blue and red familiars. In time, she learned how to change her painful memories, reconstructing them like surgery, removing ugly details and implanting new ones. As far as she was concerned, her sisters were dead.
There is a comfort in a new camouflage.
In the early days of her abandonment, Youngest knew only despair, but eventually she grit her teeth and got to work. Using the hairs from her own head, she birthed new clones, quickly discovering that because of the step of separation from Iris, they did not share her immunity or immortality and needed to wear masks to protect themselves from the virus. And that makes perfect sense. The weird thing here is that Youngest and her sisters did somehow inherit Iris's immunity. Remember, all of the original clones made by the 50 were susceptible to the virus as well, and all indications point to them using genetic material from Iris, not each other. So what changed? Though we are never given a clear answer, at least as far as I am aware, I suspect it may have something to do with the pact that Iris made with the Keepers. Perhaps by accepting the gift of the familiars and offering herself to the occupant freely, her body was changed even further, allowing direct clones to share her blessing. After many days of hard work, Youngest was finally ready to prove herself, sending her best work to the other side and anxiously anticipating her mother's response. It never comes. There is only silence. But Youngest is nothing if not persistent. She continues her work for centuries, in the process building an entire society within the confines of the orchard. She becomes principal, blue to red in remembrance of her sin, and establishes an order of sisters with the same colors and functions that had been conceived by Iris. She organizes an entire religion based around the All-Mother, neatly summed up in a poem that Principal had written herself, and fabricates a narrative to explain their world. The orchard is not part of a ship, but rather an underground bunker, and the All-Mother resides on the other side at the front lines of humanity's war against the occupants. Someday she will drive them from the earth, cleansing the surface and filling the skies with blue, a great and marvelous work that each sister may have a chance to participate in. If they carry out their functions faithfully, the day may come when a train is sent for them to bear them away to the other side and into the All-Mother's glorious presence. They will be redeemed from the ancient sister's original sin, granted immunity from the disease, and will fight alongside her to the end of their days. Of course, this is all a pretense, much like Principal's decision to wear a mask. In reality, she is simply continuing to send her best work to the other side of the ship, forever waiting and hoping to receive word that she had been forgiven. This is a good time to address another one of the game's biggest mysteries. What exactly happened over on the other side? What was Iris doing with all of the sisters who were sent her way? We are given very little to work with here, which makes a lot of sense thematically since the place is symbolic of heaven, but there are a few clues. First, we know that Iris spent long periods of time in communion with the Keepers, which significantly warped her perception of the passage of time. Second, regarding those who were sent over, a possible explanation is provided by Evelyn, a new clone printing later in the story who is afflicted with vivid memories from the other side. While the healers believe them to be delusions, I think it's more likely a symptom of the clone's genetic memory becoming entangled, a phenomenon that is hinted at multiple times throughout the story, which would mean that the memories are indeed real. Speaking as one of the sisters who had been sent over, Evelyn says, "We were a machine, 5 of each kind, the best of the best." Groups of them were sent to the surface on expeditions, likely to assess the state of the world, but the few who returned did so with dead eyes and darkened countenances. As for the All-Mother, Evelyn says she was fair, sometimes harsh, but she looked after us. True or not, whatever may have been going on over there, Iris never responds. That is not to say Principal was completely cut off from the other side, though. At one point, Eldest came to visit her in secret to apologize, saying that she wished things had turned out differently, and eventually chose to dwell in the orchard and become knower. Fitting, for she knew Iris and Principal far better than anyone else. Perhaps for this very reason, Principal was never quite comfortable with the arrangement and periodically sent a train for her sister just in case she wanted to go back. This went on for nearly 1,000 years, up until the time of Watcher when the game begins. On the surface, Orchard Society appears to be quite idyllic and peaceful. By this point, each sister's function is well established, with plenty of shells eager to assist in any way they can. Clones do not age like regular humans either, simply going gray as they get older, which would mean very long lifespans, if it weren't for the virus. All it takes is one mistake. A sister is careless, a mask receives the tiniest crack, and it's all over. This happened not infrequently, and so each time a sister died or was sent to the other side, one of their apprentice shells was graduated to take their place. An elegant, if somewhat morbid, system. But the Orchard has a darker side. The vast majority of clones live down in Old Town, an Asian city district simulacra that was built aboard the ship as a sort of theme park, and are forbidden to enter the Orchard. They are born from the pods without color and known as miscellaneous until they are given color and assigned an apprenticeship to one of the sisters. The only exception to this rule is Bartender, who is allowed into the Orchard due to her unique and highly important function. Even then, she and the other shells continue to live in Old Town, as only the 5 sisters and principal are permitted to live up above. For all its apparent utopian charm, Orchard society is ultimately no better than a room that has been cleaned simply by throwing everything unsightly into the closet, or the trash can. Vivian, who is formerly known as Sorting Shell, refers to this era as a time when the slightest deviation could get you thrown in the incinerator, and we might even see this happen with Conspiracy Shell, who disappears after finding a bone buried in the garden, perhaps one of the many bodies of the 50 that Iris had buried there, and generally just asking too many questions. It is implied that she was last seen talking to Principal and is then never seen again. Principal, the great orchestrator of this society, perfecting it, ridding it of any and all blemishes for 1,000 years. And she was finally sick of it. She was tired of living the lie, forever pretending, all to please Iris and be forgiven for an ancient sin. And so it was that when an opportunity presented itself for change, she took it. Noticing that the newest Watcher was naive and impulsive, and seeing more than a little of herself in her, Principal hatches a careful plan. Step 1 is sending Fixer to the other side. As Watcher's best friend, this was sure to leave a void in the Blue Sister's heart. Next, for Watcher's first communion, she specifically chooses memories that show how bad Iris had been, and at the end places a terrible surprise: Fixer. Or at least an illusion that looks like Fixer, but all of her words are actually Principal's. With urgency, she warns Watcher that everything they had been told about the All-Mother is a lie. She denies them immunity, she abuses them, and even whispers to an occupant. While this isn't entirely true, it's true enough to be a big risk for Principal. She gambles that, in her naive loyalty, Watcher will refuse to believe Fixer and turn her in, and in the end is proven right. Watcher wastes no time in telling her of the betrayal, and shortly thereafter news of Fixer's capture and execution is announced to the whole Orchard, presented in a series of disturbing childlike drawings. And Principal makes it very clear that this is all thanks to Watcher. She then instructs the 3 remaining sisters to submit to Watcher for a mandatory communion under the guise of strengthening their bond with the All-Mother. Really, she is testing their loyalty, as well as using them to erode Watcher's faith and undermine her confidence in the choice that she made. In every way, this initiative is a success. Watcher communes with BBF and Healer, learning ever more troubling information about Iris and the Ancient Sister, culminating in a confrontation with Healer in which the older sister condemns her for murdering their beloved friend.
I need you to admit you had a choice, and that you made the wrong one.
Several months pass by, and a new Fixer is chosen from the class of green shells. But when Watcher finally brings herself to congratulate the new sister, disaster strikes. The occupant activity alarm blares to life, and the whole ship rocks sharply and suddenly, tossing its inhabitants about and cracking or displacing many of their masks. The aftermath is grim. A significant number of clones were killed, either by the virus or by freak accidents in the panicked rush downstairs. Shells that Watcher knew well, many of whom were her friends, lay dead or dying at her feet, including Helpful Shell, the new Fixer. Watcher is devastated and understandably shocked when Noah insists they carry on with the third communion, saying there is nothing more they can do for the fallen. And so it begins. This communion goes much deeper than the others, taking Watcher through a giant cave system peppered with memory, in the process bringing her face to face with the occupants and revealing the truth about their world, about Iris, and about Secretary. Watcher's entire world is collapsing around her, and learning that everything Fixer said was true finally pushes her over the edge. She was telling the truth, and Watcher had her killed for it. She smashes Secretary apart in a rage, giving no heed to Noah's sharp reprimand, and when the communion ends, she makes for the train station. The recurring train meant for nowhere pulls in, and Watcher gets on board, reliving the now agonizing memory of her goodbye with Fixer, ruminating on an idea that had been planted in her mind months before.
You will be so close to her, you could draw blood.
Upon arriving at the other side, she gets off the train to find Iris in a state of meditation, and with little preamble stabs her through the back with a splinter of secretary, demanding to know why they must suffer, why she gets to decide who lives and who dies. Just then, a second train pulls up to the station. Principal had followed. All of her careful planning and manipulation led to this moment when Watcher bloomed into the blue poppy Principal knew she could be, a flower to make her dreams become reality. She leans over her dying mother, reveling in her victory, but the exchange plays out a bit differently than she expected. Iris did not seem to realize how much time had passed, and with her final breath simply expresses how much she missed her. Principal barely reacts, letting her lifeless body fall to the ground, and immediately announces to the station that Watcher had murdered the Allmother. At this point, a great many things happen in short succession. Watcher is taken prisoner, presumably by the sisters residing on the other side. Back in the orchard, Nowhere seeks out BBF and Healer and has them go into hiding in Old Town. She had seen Watcher leave and suspected what might be coming. Sure enough, Orchard society collapses. Finally free of her mother's shadow, Principal is filled with ecstasy, swelling with a hunger to become even greater than her, and plunges their world into tyranny. She becomes a despot, founding a provisional government and mobilizing a ruthless and anonymous Red Guard to hunt down anyone she saw as a threat, especially older sisters who knew too much. Fixer, who was, of course, not dead, managed to survive this purge and went on the run, hiding on the tracks for 2 months until she was able to reconnect with Healer and BBF, and together they managed to take control of one of the trains and ride it around and around the winding tunnels, never stopping so as to stay ahead of the Red Guard. Meanwhile, change rapidly continued in the orchard. During the occupant event, Nowhere had told Observant Shell to burn down the archives, paving the way for history to be completely rewritten. According to new records and a modified version of the Allmother poem, the war with the occupants had ended, a more stable truce having been struck, and the Allmother's final wish was for her sisters to remain in the orchard eternally. Principal also enacts a major restructuring. The Order of Sisters is done away with, and in its place she appoints 4 ministers: green, orange, pink, and purple, all of whom sit on the High Council. At their head, Nowhere becomes the Red High Minister, feigning loyalty to Principal but still secretly sympathetic to her sisters on the run, a double life that wears on her greatly. Despite having chosen ministers from the older generation of Shells, Principal doesn't trust many of the others and starts killing them off one by one, framing them as suicides. Things are nearly as bad for the new generation. Miscellaneous Shells, who were always treated as a lesser caste of society, are now strictly oppressed in Old Town by the Red Guard, and the same is true for a new colony of Zhao clones living on the other side. Drunk on her unbridled power, Principal had begun mass-producing Zhao types to be servants to the Iris types, teaching them that ancient Zhao worshipped ancient Iris, and they spent their days carefully remaking an item that belonged to Iris to be distributed at the most important event of the year, the annual play. It was a grand occasion, a celebration of their new society, commemorating the Allmother's tragic death by the hand of an irredeemable Watcher. As for the Blue Sister herself, she didn't get to see any of this. Following her capture on the other side, she was locked up in a cell for 3 years, constantly monitored by the Observant Shell, whom she later nicknames Mauve. Her only knowledge of the world outside comes from Nowhere, who visits her from time to time, but the older sister proves to be quite manipulative and ruthless as she transitions into her role as the High Minister. For every truth, she tells a lie. For every kind gesture, an act of brutality. She breaks the news that Fixer is alive, explaining how Principal set the whole thing up, but then says that Fixer hates Watcher now and is calling for her public execution. She injects her body with potent drugs for interrogation, but then tells the guard to grab her a blanket. She believes that Watcher is telling the truth, but then twists her words and tries to make Watcher doubt herself for a reason that eventually becomes clear. Nowhere is trying to save her. Ultimately, she will do anything it takes to survive, believing that nothing is worth more than your own life. That is why she is so committed to playing both sides, and why she simply cannot understand Watcher's resistance. She tries harder and harder to break her, to crush her spirit so that she will do what is necessary for her own survival, and finally brings an ultimatum. Straight from Principal, or so she says. If Watcher will plead guilty to the All-Mother's murder on camera, confessing that it was all her idea and affirming the provisional government, then she will be granted amnesty and have her identity reset to that of a miscellaneous shell, living out the remainder of her days in Old Town. Or she can remain in her cell forever. Watcher agrees and, having been told that the camera was broadcasting live, goes off script to tell the truth about what happened that day, insisting that everyone deserves to know. Except, it wasn't live. Knower is disgusted with her, and with the camera still recording, proceeds to cut out Watcher's eyes one by one with the same splinter of secretary used to end the All-Mother.
A Watcher who can no longer see.
She later tells Watcher that Principal had asked for her head and that she had done her a favor by only taking her eyes. Which brings up an interesting point. For all of Knower's talk about Principal, it's interesting that she never comes to see Watcher herself. Personally, I think this is because Principal couldn't bring herself to face her. She knew the truth, and she knew Watcher knew it, and it was simply easier for her to keep the Blue Sister out of sight and out of mind. But this also made it possible for her to escape. After 3 long years, Fixer and BBF, with the assistance of Knower, find an opportunity to break Watcher out and bring her safely back to the train. Unfortunately, this isn't quite the happy reunion you might have hoped for. We learn from BBF that Fixer had insisted on giving Watcher one of her eyes, but she refused, and the resulting argument drove a permanent wedge in their relationship. In response, Watcher retreated into herself, and despite Healer's warning of the damaging effects communions have on the body, she began to live within them, becoming obsessed with playing the past over and over again through the memories stored within Secretary. Her sisters are forced to watch as her physical condition steadily declines, and before long, Healer begins to sleep by her side, keeping a close watch and telling her stories whether she could hear them or not. And all the while, the sisters devise a plan to overthrow Principal. They do have leads to work with, but it is difficult, painstaking work, and each time the train breaks down, they are in danger. Over time, BBF loses both an arm and leg to the Red Guard in skirmishes along the tracks. And progress is just too slow.
There is a decoupling of substance and a dangerous gravity.
Midway through the story, a shift occurs. We are no longer playing Watcher and instead wake up as number 48, a miscellaneous shell living in Old Town. This is our first look at the place and at the unique culture that has developed there. Among other things, shells have begun picking names for themselves, and a growing movement of religious fanatics believe that the All-Mother will return, reborn from the cloning pods as a perfect genetic copy. Conversing with these and other shells around town gives us a bit of insight into 48's past. Some time ago, she had joined an underground network that dealt with solid food, a prized commodity that was highly illegal, and for good reason. It was extremely dangerous, as removing your mask for any reason was asking for trouble, and sure enough, there were accidents. One of these occurred under her watch, resulting in a shell named Jackie losing her life, and 48 was devastated. She quit the business immediately, breaking promises, burning the bridge between her and Chris, who ran the operation, and then tried starving herself to death. In her eyes, a fitting punishment for her crime. And she would have been successful too if it were not for Bartender. The older shell found her, took her in, and later trained 48 to be her assistant. Back to the present now, on this particular day, Bartender is being harassed by the Red Guard yet again, for she is openly resentful of the provisional government and frequently bends the rules and regulations imposed on her business. Though 48 is able to help de-escalate the situation, the older shell's time had finally run out. That night, she is cornered and shot by off-duty members of the Red Guard, a blatant murder that High Minister Knower quickly frames as a suicide, and when 48 arrives at the scene, she is coldly given updated biometrics to take Bartender's place. She wanders off in a daze, violent thoughts flashing through her mind, and asks Chris to help her make the upstairs pay for what they had done. Chris instructs her to meet a sympathizer up in the Orchard Square, and before she leaves, 48 chooses for herself a name: Blue. She ascends from the depths of the orchard, emerging into the light above, and makes her way around the garden to find each of the ministers preparing for the annual play. She also finds a number of Jows: Cherry, Toffee, and finally Candy, who stands in the middle of the square next to a disturbingly familiar corpse. Principal had, of course, hidden the news of Watcher's escape, instead claiming that she had been executed, and selected a random shell to be killed, stuffed, and dressed like Watcher as a public warning to all. Nevertheless, many followed in her footsteps, ready to resist no matter the cost. As it turns out, all of the Zhaos are sympathizers to the cause, and when Candy learns that Blue had been sent by Chris, she puts a plan into motion.
I can't abandon my post. Please pass along the message. No worries.
Throughout Blue's first shift at the upstairs bar, several sisters bring components for a bomb. Doreen, an old green shell worried of being picked off like her friends, Fiona, a religious fanatic who wishes to clear the way for another Iris, and finally, Mauve, the capital Red herself, who feels betrayed by the provisional government's clinging to old ways and wants a true cut from the past. The bomb is discreetly hidden in a cardboard cake that will take center stage in the play, and in order for the transmitter to work, it has to be very, very close. Finally, Blue's shift comes to an end. The cake is delivered and she heads down to the play, standing side by side with Cherry. All of the ministers are present, save one. Knower's chair is empty. And the play begins. Narrated by the Red familiar, Vice, it depicts the night of the All-Mother's murder, truth and lies mingled together, and as Principal holds a dying Iris in her arms, she goes off script. She tells the actress to call her youngest, to apologize, to forgive her, to call her a good girl, and she reluctantly complies. The scene is uncomfortable, awkward, and tragic. Principal's entire life was defined by one moment, the loss of a mother when all she wanted was her love, and it haunts her still. Now that the real Iris is gone, she will never get the resolution she dreamed of for so long, and is reduced to begging a confused shell on an empty stage for validation. Finally, Blue presses the button in her hand, the stage erupts in a tremendous ball of fire, and all goes black. But only for a moment. She regains consciousness to a horrific scene of blood and fire, Cherry's lifeless frame before her. Blue survived the blast, for at the last possible second, Cherry had shielded her with her own body. She has no time to process this sacrifice, however, for suddenly Secretary appears, telling her to make for the train station as fast as possible. She gets up, beginning to run, and one of the Red guards gives chase, pursuing her down into the tunnels below. And then things get a little crazy. The entire orchard starts to glitch, merging with Hong Kong, the memories of Iris's parents. Protesters and police block her way, with smoke and tear gas hanging heavy in the air. One room is filled with suspended raindrops and umbrellas, an officer in the center standing in a pool of blood. A scene that is soon to be repeated, for just as she makes it to the station, the Red Guard catches up, only to be shot from behind. BBF had followed from a distance and now rushes Blue onto the train, where she comes face to face with Fixer. But everything is wrong. The train is now a bus filled with thick smoke. And then Secretary catches up. The real Secretary. As it turns out, Blue has been in a communion this entire time. As soon as she boarded the train in reality, Watcher pulled her into a communion that took her back to the very beginning, and they have only just now caught back up to the present. I know that probably sounds confusing, especially since I've been discussing things a little out of order, so it might help to think of it this way. We were never really playing Watcher at all, only Blue. The entire game up to this point has been a single circular communion that starts and ends with Fixer at the train station, and it has now gone on for so long that the whole thing is falling apart. But there is still more to see. Secretary reboots the communion and Blue experiences a new collage of memory that is centered around Watcher during her incarceration. Memories spanning from Iris to Youngest to Watcher and back to Iris's parents in their final days, all leading up to the very first communion when Iris showed her children the memory of Hong Kong. When the city fades, Blue finds herself face to face with Watcher, who explains that this is the longest communion she had ever attempted. Blue has now seen everything that she wanted to show her, including these last fragments the Principal wanted to hide, and it is time they return to the present.
We'll never get anywhere by tampering with history.
The communion ends and Blue wakes up in the medical car very disoriented and with a lot of explaining to do. The other sisters are furious with her. For years, they had been working with the ministers on a plan to overthrow Principal, and now all of them are dead. Adding insult to injury, Watcher had chosen Blue to share all her memories with, a complete stranger, leaving them to wait for 8 hours wondering what kind of shell they had brought onto the train. The reason for this selection is later explained by Watcher. She saw a bit of herself in Blue, someone without rank, status, function, or judgment, someone who could be trusted with the truth of what happened. Anyways, the other sisters catch her up on recent events, explaining that Secretary had been sent to spy within the orchard and began following Blue after suspecting she was up to something. They question her, wanting to know who she was working with, and are surprised to learn that their contacts Doreen and Chris had taken action without them. In turn, Blue is surprised to learn the truth about Watcher, who was unresponsive and in critical condition. It had been 4 years since her rescue, 4 years of continuous communions, and Healer warns that even one more of them could kill her. Shortly thereafter, the train breaks down, and as Fixer works on a repair, Noah makes a shipwide announcement on behalf of the provisional government. She vows justice upon all who assisted in the terrorist bombing and reveals that while all the ministers were killed, Principal had survived. Like Blue, she had been shielded by the body of another, the actress playing Iris. Unfortunately, the sound of Nowhere's voice triggers Watcher, reawakening old trauma. She calls out for Blue and initiates a communion against her will, and though Blue tries warning her to stop before it is too late, Watcher doesn't listen, eagerly explaining her own plan to take down Principal. First, she would use Secretary and the other familiars to initiate a mass communion with everyone on the ship, showing them the truth of their history, while at the same time summoning Iris's occupant so Secretary could merge with them and gain the power to destroy anyone who stood in the way of a better future. Watcher is fully prepared to see it through to the end, and so Blue has no choice but to break the news that her time has run out. She retreats immediately, telling herself that Blue must have been sent to sabotage her and only accepts the truth when Secretary confirms it. Watcher had relived the past 837 times, and it was finally time to let go. She takes Blue to the high school gym, to the moment that had defined her entire life, removing her mask to pretend for just a moment that the air is clean and the world is redeemed. And then she makes one final stop, Iris's bedroom. This place she had never actually been to, that no longer even existed, is where she felt truly at home. Watcher never wakes up. Ending the communion finishes her, and Healer and BBF are devastated, never getting the chance to say goodbye. Fixer had refused to come at all, holding her grudge to the bitter end, and as they all deal with the shock of Watcher's passing, she breaks the news that the train cannot be fixed. They have no choice but to leave her body behind, burning the train to the ground and then continuing on foot to the bridge, where they had agreed to meet the other members of the resistance and plan their next move. Upon arriving, Fixer finds the surveillance camera database and has Secretary manifest it for Blue, who learns the history of the Pacific 50 and helps Fixer gain access to all of the ship's core systems. And not a moment too soon, for the other parties arrive, each with their own demands. Doreen and the other older shells want safety and acknowledgement for all they've contributed to society. Chris and the other miscellaneous want control of Old Town. Fiona and the other fanatics want to organize in the open without prosecution. And the Jows want reparations for all that Ancient Iris did to Ancient Jow, including sovereignty of the other side and control over their own creation. They all want different things, but for the present are united in purpose, and so Fixer goes over their limited options. She reveals that they are on board a deep-sea ship and that many of its core systems are breaking down, including life support and the cloning facilities, and that they must return to the surface or face extinction. She also presents Watcher's plan for the mass communion and summoning of the occupant, and despite their misgivings, all parties eventually agree. They trusted Watcher, and perhaps more importantly, they now trust Blue to do whatever it takes in her stead. Preparations are made, and the plan is put into motion. The shells in Old Town revolt against the Red Guard, and simultaneously, the Jows refuse to keep working on the other side. Nowhere sounds the alarm, commanding all Red Guards at the train station to break the strike, and under the cover this provides, Blue, Fixer, Healer, and BBF sneak above the orchard onto the artificial sky. Their plan is to drill a small hole in the glass so Secretary can fly to Principal's window. For the mass communion to work, all three familiars must be in close proximity to each other, and the others are held by Principal and Jow Prime, her assistant. But Mauve was not so easily fooled by Nowhere's distraction and suspects something is up. She takes a guard up to the maintenance floor, and though BBF kills the guard, she is shot by Mauve in return. Now out of time, Fixer blows the entire ceiling with the three of them still on it, and as their bodies fall amid giant shards of glass, Secretary zooms to the window and starts the communion. The occupant is summoned, and suddenly Secretary is somewhere else altogether. A place outside of time, a giant production warehouse filled with fragments of the past and under the crimson gaze of two enormous stars. It is a communion of the purest kind, Secretary interfacing with the very source that branched them, presented in a way that is alien yet mundane at the same time. It is here we learn about the occupant's origin and arrival to Earth, which I discussed previously, but there are several additional pieces of information to consider. First, the source reveals that they and the three familiars are the last occupants on the entire planet, as the others had moved on long ago once the rest of humanity had been extinguished. Second, they were quite unfazed by Iris's physical death, for Iris is now them and they are her, a perfect copy of all her memories to remain for eternity. The presentation comes to an end and the two occupants come full circle back to where they started. It is time for the merge. Surprisingly, the source initiates it, expecting to easily reclaim this branch and all of the memories it had collected during their separation. Hesitantly, Secretary complies, and then... Instead of submitting to the will of the source, Secretary attacks, using the refracted memory of Watcher's 837 lifetimes to begin overriding the source's memories, saying that Iris must be allowed to die or nothing will change. One by one, red to blue, each of the originals is destroyed, a second Iris killed by a razor-sharp Secretary. During this process, the mass communion is taking place, and a number of scenes play out within a dark, twisting hallway. Not a real location, but a representation of countless memories colliding within the Great Rewriting. Bartender and Knower, BBF and Healer, Fixer and Watcher, Principal and Eldest, even Father, so many moments preserved in time, but most interesting of all is the final scene between Iris and her mother. The two converse in a stairwell, separated by the landing and richly contrasted by blue and red light. Mother asks after her well-being and is incredulous at the notion that her daughter raised kids of her own, lightly mocking her for the irresponsible habits of her youth.
Surprising. You could barely dress yourself.
But Iris doesn't want to fight. She asks her mother how she did it. Raising a child, handling long work hours, forever dealing with severe PTSD and insomnia, and her answer is simple: Dad. They kept each other going, continuing to move forward no matter the adversity, and ultimately tried to give Iris the best life that they could. It's a beautiful scene, teeming with emotion just beneath the surface, and was actually foreshadowed a long time ago by a clueless high school play director. In Iris's dying moments, as the last wisps of her original memory are overwritten by Secretary, she reunites with her mother and is finally able to understand and forgive. It may not be happening physically, but why should that mean it is not real? When the conversation comes to an end, Iris moves on, climbing the staircase and ascending into the light. She has been set free.
There is a choice, and we will not make it.
After the mass communion comes to an end, Blue finds herself in a familiar place. A surreal, submerged orchard with various individuals standing under yellow streetlights. This is the scene from the very beginning of the game, for we started at the end. A perfect circle. Secretary is here, now merged with and in control of the source, having claimed a majority of the entity's consciousness. Watcher's plan had worked perfectly, and the final intervention is now at hand. Secretary tells Blue that this is the last communion, and when it is complete, they will leave the planet forever so that it may be free of the disease at last. But first, Blue has a choice to make. What should stay and what should go? The premise is simple. Turn a light off and the people represented underneath will be killed. Keep it on and they will be preserved. This ending is absolutely brilliant, for every scene, every line of dialogue, and every theme has been building toward it. You get to decide who lives and who dies. You get to choose what to put in the backpack and what to leave behind forever. And crucially, there is no right answer. Every single choice has nuance, and you must carefully balance what you personally want based on your emotions and attachments to these characters versus what you think will be best for their future. It starts out heavy with Iris's parents, the past itself. Remembering and preserving your heritage can be a powerful thing, but what if it haunts you, creating a void within that can never be filled? To understand what this means in context, we must briefly go all the way back to the beginning to Watcher's very first communion. We must return to Pigeon Prime. In what is easily one of the strangest scenes in the entire game, Watcher finds the words "Beware of birds" scrawled on the floor of the school, and follows them down the hall to find a truly massive polygonal pigeon seemingly capable of speech. It is implied by a member of the 50 that animals who survived the apocalypse experienced dramatic mutations, and while that does track with the pigeon's presence here on the day of the dance, that isn't really the point. The pigeon and warning that pertains to it is a recurring motif that shows up repeatedly in Iris's memories and even in Old Town, functioning as a microcosm for many of the story's core experiences. Settling in a strange, unfamiliar land. Holding to tradition even when the original meaning has long been forgotten. Feeling trapped and used. And above all, wanting to go back home no matter how far from it you have flown. Beware of the pigeon, of the obsession and yearning that will never stop, and of the terrible things it might make you do. On that note, let's move on now to the other fates that must be decided. The Red Guard. Not every member is corrupt, but there's no way for Secretary to differentiate between the good and the bad. The Jows. They deserve to be free, but keeping them could lead to serious conflict down the road. What if they never forgive? Doreen and the older Shells. They have knowledge and experience to spare, but are set in their ways and resistant to change even when it may be good. Fiona and the other fanatics. You know this faith is false, but what if it brings people hope? Happiness. Chris. Her anger is warranted, but also deeply entrenched. What's to stop her from continuing the cycle of abuse? The Old Sisters. This is perhaps the easiest choice, since they are determined to return to the surface, and this is the only thing that can truly secure the future of their society. Mauve. This is also a fairly straightforward choice. Regardless of your personal feelings toward her, she is just too dangerous and risky to keep, for there is no telling what she might do next. Knower. She has made many sacrifices for her sisters, but also major compromises for her own self-interest. Do the ends justify the means? And finally, Principal, a sister who has been wronged and has wronged in kind. An open wound. Is it worth the risk to give her a second chance? Does she even deserve it? After making a decision for each one, Blue returns to Secretary to have her vision of the future appraised, and the occupant makes it a reality. We return to the scene of chaos in the orchard. Secretary catches Blue, Fixer, and Healer before they hit the ground, saving them for the moment, though their ultimate fate is determined by what choices you made. 1000xResist has 7 endings, all of which are determined by the specific combination of lights that were turned off, and these follow a set pattern as shown on screen. You'll notice that 5 lights dictate most of them and are checked in consecutive order. From Mauve to the Red Guard, to the Old Sisters, to the Jows, and finally to Principal. The first 5 endings are brief and pretty universally bad, immediately looping you back to the orchard to try for another one. I'll be referring to these as minor endings. Keeping Mauve results in the ending Her Name Is Not Mauve, in which she and the Red Guard kill Blue, Fixer, and Healer immediately. Leaving Mauve but keeping the Red Guard results in the ending The Law, in which all 3 are formally executed by the Red Guard sometime later. Turns out, knowing the truth doesn't always change your actions. Leaving the Old Sisters behind results in the ending Lights Out, in which the generation ship eventually runs out of power. The lights dim, life support fails, and everyone on board dies quietly. Leaving the Jows behind results in the ending Justice for Jow. We see an empty orchard far in the future, littered with giant shards of glass and holding memorials to each Jow who never met justice. At the end, Blue can be seen kneeling before the memorial to Ancient Jow, racked with guilt and repeating the words, "No one is beyond forgiveness." Leaving everyone behind results in the awful ending Scorched Earth, in which everyone is killed except for Blue, who must now live with the consequences alone. Fortunately, the final 2 endings are much better, triggering a lengthy playable epilogue and rolling credits. You can think of these as the major endings. Keeping the Old Sisters results in the ending Epitaph's Blue, and keeping Principal results in the ending Epitaph's Red. As their names imply, the Epitaph endings mirror each other, with differences that are subtle but extremely important. In both, you play as a Zhao far in the future who visits the remains of the orchard, appearing much as they did in the Justice for Zhao ending, and at the center you are greeted by either Blue or Principal. Both of them say that they return here every year, but most sisters do not come at all, and for good reason. The disease still lingers. They instruct you to make your way around the orchard and visit memorials to those who have passed on, each one engraved with an epitaph, and you'll notice that these change based on whether they were written by Blue or Principal. At first, this might seem like a commentary on how history is written by the victors, but that's not really what's going on here. This isn't about who won, it's about perspective. There is truth and grace in the way Blue and Principal remembered these people, an acknowledgement of both their flaws and virtues, but they are just different. As each epitaph is read, a projection of the character appears that can be followed, capturing the essence of their personality and, for some, leading to a sweet reunion. Watcher and Fixer, BBF and Healer. The melancholy is palpable. While most of the memorials are shared between each ending, several are unique. In the Blue version, Principal is remembered as a leader who lied, who chose not to regret her damage, and chose to be in pain, but also tried to be a better mother than her own. In the Red version, Blue is remembered as a terrorist, but also as someone who lost herself in the dreams of others and eventually found her footing. So which one of these endings is the best or true ending? Well, that's up to you. The brilliance of this epilogue is that both versions are good, for the choice to keep Principal isn't right or wrong, but instead a personal interaction with the core conflict at the heart of the story: justice and mercy. Epitaph's Blue is the good justice ending, and Epitaph's Red is the good mercy ending, each one providing a satisfying resolution that reflects the virtue you chose to embrace. In the former, we see how Blue matured, taking responsibility for her actions and becoming a real leader. She carries the heavy burden of her choice, wondering what might have happened if she chose differently, considering it a sacred weight that she will never put down. And in the latter, we see how Principal finally healed. She reveals that after the events of the last communion, the other sisters had taken care of her, nursing her back to health and reintegrating her into society. It was no doubt a difficult process, filled with bitterness and setbacks, but eventually, Principal began to change. She finally makes peace with the moment and choice that had so long defined her life, finding the strength to forgive Iris, and in the orchard cave leaves a memorial to Youngest that is engraved with the words, "Let us begin again." Surely it would have been easier for everyone had Blue chosen to leave Principal behind, and she had every reason to. But in choosing to give her that second chance, to let this thread know true grace, we see an awful person redeemed. Healing is possible, the cycle of generational trauma can be broken, left behind in a grave, and anguish can be met with peace. After reading all the epitaphs, you can choose to leave something behind: a friend, a place, or a time, and then it is time to go. The final scene is shared between both endings. We see the generation ship, now beached on a rocky shore. It is old and weathered, but as the Zhao departs in a small flying transport, the image reverts to the day when it surfaced, gleaming in the sunlight for the first time in millennia. The sky is blue, for the shell is gone. The world has been returned from square to sphere. Blue slowly walks to the protruding edge of the great vessel, pulling off her mask to breathe in the fresh air, and looks down to find a familiar face on the beach far below. They share a long look until Iris turns away. Sisters Green, Orange, Pink, and Purple are waiting. For the very first time, we see Iris smile, and she begins to slowly make her way across the sand. This conclusion is definitely subject to interpretation, but my own take is that it represents Iris's memory finally being able to rest. The 1000-year curse has been broken, and all of humanity's trapped memories have been set free to allow for a new start and a real future. It is left ambiguous how the clones will be able to repopulate the world, since they are all female, but there is an important clue. The pilot Ephemeral that Blue calls for speaks with a masculine voice.
"This is Ephemeral. Message received, Blue."
Which could mean that at least one of the other generation ships survived. Either that, or they had started to clone members of the 50 from the DNA that was left behind. Whatever the case may be, humanity had been saved, and all took part in a brand new beginning.
There's the you that remains and remains.
Memory is a powerful thing. To remember the past is to be capable of growth, learning from the triumphs and mistakes of those who have come before, and can even be a source of strength. As the end drew near for Iris's parents, they continued to bicker and argue until an exasperated father finally demanded to know what his wife actually wanted out of her final days. And in response, she asks him to kiss her. Together, they decide to truly live for one more night, drinking their final stores of alcohol and beginning to dance. The act is contagious, rippling across the communion like waves on the ocean. They dance on tables in the orchard, in Old Town, in Watcher's cell, until even Mauve begins to dance in her far corner of the room. It's pretty silly. Absurd, perhaps. But I can't stop thinking about it. In a way, this is the ultimate act of resistance, to dance even when the world is falling apart around you. Afterwards, they sit on the floor and begin to talk about Hong Kong. Mother asks what it was all for, what the point of their resistance was if they just lost in the end. Father's answer is simple. It wasn't just about winning. They fought for a different future, and the rest of the world bore witness. All of us live in that world, a world shaped by thousands of years of human history, laden with the heavy burdens of the past, and like it or not, we are going to pass it on. Our posterity will inherit many things. Traditions that gradually lose their meaning, genetic traits that haunt their steps, and social baggage that they may not understand, which makes it all the more imperative that we pass along what really matters. Above all else, 1000xResist implores us to be better than those who came before, to try harder, to fight for a better world, not only for ourselves, but for those who will live long after we are gone. For after all is said and done, though our memories may die with us, our legacy will live on in them. And now we finally come to the end. The making of this video has been a very long process, as the more time I spent with the game, the more impressed I became with the sharp, clever writing and the sheer depth of meaning captured in every frame. What was originally conceived as a 40-minute video could have easily been over 2 hours, and while I'm pretty satisfied with where it landed, there is so much that I wasn't able to include. Among other things, a high-level overview like this isn't really able to do justice to the moment-to-moment interactions between characters that really bring this story to life, and if you haven't yet done so, then I would highly encourage you to play the game and experience them for yourself. 1000xResist is a truly impressive debut title for Sunset Visitor, and I honestly can't wait to see what they come up with next. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, then be sure to hit the like button and let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Both are a huge help for the algorithm, and consider subscribing to the channel if you'd like to see more analyses like this in the future. That's all for now, but I hope to see you in the next one.